There is a moment inside every royal family when something shifts. It does not happen at a state banquet or during a public walkabout. It does not come with an announcement. It arrives quietly in a private room behind a closed door when one person decides that something has gone too far and something else must now be done. That moment for King Charles III came with a decision so unexpected, so carefully calculated, and so deeply personal that even those who had served the palace for decades found themselves sitting back in their chairs, genuinely unsure of what they had just been told. He had made his choice. He had put his sister in charge, and the palace would never quite be the same again. Before anyone understood what was happening, before the whispers began traveling down the corridors of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, there was simply a growing quiet between two people who had once seemed perfectly matched. King Charles and Queen Camilla had walked through one of the most complicated romantic stories in modern royal history. They had endured decades of public scrutiny, personal scandal, and the kind of hatred that comes when millions of people blame you for the collapse of something they loved. And yet they had survived it. They had come out the other side. By the time Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey in May 2023, Camilla was seated beside him not as a figure of controversy, but as a queen, formal and recognized, with a crown of her own. It had seemed, to many, like the ending of a very long and painful story. What nobody knew was that the story was only just entering its most complicated chapter. Charles had always been a complicated man to understand. Those who knew him best would tell you that he carried two versions of himself at all times. The first was the public Charles, formal, considered, deliberate in every word and gesture, a man shaped by decades of protocol and expectation. The second was the private Charles, a man who felt things very deeply, who could be wounded by people he loved, who had strong instincts about loyalty and betrayal, and who, when pushed, was far more decisive than the world gave him credit for. It was the second Charles who began to pay very close attention in the months that followed his coronation, and what he saw, when he looked carefully, began to trouble him. Queen Camilla had stepped into her role with a confidence that surprised even some of her supporters. She had always been charming in private settings, warm in the way that made people feel at ease, and smart enough to read a room without appearing to try. Those qualities served her well as queen consort. She moved with assurance through state events and royal engagements, handled the press with a kind of relaxed ease that Charles, with his more guarded nature, had never quite managed, and was widely credited with softening the public image of the monarchy at a time when it needed softening badly. Princess Anne herself had said so publicly, in a rare and widely noted moment during a BBC documentary about Charles's coronation year. Anne described Camilla's understanding of her role as absolutely outstanding. She had praised her sister-in-law's ability to provide a different kind of energy alongside the king, and the royal watching world had taken note. Anne was not a woman who gave out compliments carelessly. If she said it, she meant it. But meaning it then and believing it now were two different things. Because sometime between those warm words in a documentary and the growing unease behind palace walls, something had changed. Camilla's confidence, which had once seemed like an asset, had begun to evolve into something that the people around her found harder to name and harder to accept. She was, by every outward measure, fulfilling her role. She was attending engagements, representing the crown, appearing at the right events at the right times. But there were other things happening, things that did not appear in the court circular or get photographed on official visits, that were beginning to raise questions in certain very important quarters. The questions were about money. More precisely, they were about the way money was being spent, who was making those decisions, and whether the person responsible for oversight was in full command of what was actually happening. Charles had always believed deeply in fiscal responsibility when it came to the royal household. He had carried this conviction since long before he was king, spending decades arguing that the monarchy needed to be leaner, more transparent, more accountable to the public it represented. That belief had sharpened considerably in the years after Queen Elizabeth's death, when the scale of royal funding had come under intense scrutiny, and the institution had felt, more than once, the heat of public criticism aimed at how its money was being used. Charles took that seriously. He took it personally. And so when it became apparent to him that the financial arrangements surrounding Camilla's household and official activities were not moving in the direction he expected, he did not ignore it. The spending patterns that began to draw attention were not dramatic in an obvious way. There was no single purchase, no single trip, no single decision that could be pointed to as the moment everything went wrong. What there was instead was an accumulation, a gradual drift toward expenditure that felt, to those reviewing the accounts, like it was operating without the kind of discipline the king had insisted upon. Staff costs, travel decisions, the manner in which certain personal and official expenses were being categorized, or sometimes not clearly categorized at all. There were questions about oversight and questions about who was actually in the room when financial decisions were made. The answers to those questions, when they came back to Charles through the people he trusted, were not reassuring. And it was at this point that he turned to Anne. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, is 75 years old. She has been carrying out royal duties for over 50 years. She has completed more official engagements in a single year than almost any other working royal in the history of the modern British monarchy. She has ridden in the Olympics. She has been kidnapped at gunpoint and negotiated with her attacker. She has traveled to places that her siblings have never been and worked with organizations that the palace often barely noticed. She is, in the most straightforward possible terms, the hardest person in the royal family to fool. She does not engage in flattery. She does not waste words. She has a way of looking at a situation and seeing exactly what it is, stripped of all the presentation and ceremony that tends to surround royal life, and then saying precisely what she thinks about it in language that is difficult to misinterpret. Charles had known all of this his entire life. It was exactly why he needed her now. The two siblings had always been close in the particular way that the children of Queen Elizabeth tended to be close, shaped by the same unusual childhood, the same extraordinary circumstances, the same sense of being born into something that could never fully be explained to anyone who had not lived it. There was between them a shorthand that only siblings share, a way of communicating that needed very few words. When Charles reached out to Anne in the weeks following his growing unease about the financial arrangements in Camilla's household, she understood before he had finished explaining what he was actually asking her. She did not flinch. She did not express surprise. What she did was ask the kind of precise, practical questions that told him immediately she had already been thinking about some of this herself. The decision was not made lightly. Charles was not a man who moved quickly on things that touched his personal life, and this touched several things at once: his marriage, his household, his institution, and his own carefully cultivated image as a king who believed in transparency and accountability. Putting his sister in a position of financial oversight over his wife's affairs was not a small gesture. It was not the kind of thing that could be dressed up in softer language. It meant that Charles did not fully trust the existing arrangements. It meant he was willing to create a structure that placed Anne, rather than any of the palace officials who reported through Camilla's household, in a direct and authoritative role. The implications of that, once it became known, would be enormous. Charles understood that. He did it anyway. The palace staff who first became aware of what had been decided were, by all accounts, stunned. Not because they believed Anne was incapable of the role. Everyone who worked at the palace knew that Anne was capable of almost anything she put her mind to, but because of what the decision signaled about the relationship between the king and the queen. These were not people who were easily rattled. They had served through the upheavals of Charles and Diana's marriage, through the tragedy that followed, through the slow and complicated rehabilitation of Camilla's public image across more than 2 decades. They had seen things that would never appear in any biography or documentary. And yet this particular piece of news, when it traveled through the corridors in the way that significant palace news always does, quietly and precisely, and landing in exactly the right ears, produced a reaction that the most experienced among them described simply as shock. It was not the last shock this story would deliver. The silence between a husband and wife can tell you more about a marriage than any argument ever could. It is not the sharp silence of a fresh wound, not the stunned quiet that follows a single terrible revelation. The silence that matters is the kind that builds slowly, that settles into the corners of shared rooms and shared routines, that shows up at dinner tables and in the pauses between conversations about nothing important. By the time King Charles had made his decision about Princess Anne, the silence between him and Camilla had already been building for some time. And now, with the decision made and the first careful people informed, the silence had taken on a very different quality. It had weight. It had history behind it. And for Camilla, when she understood fully what had been done, it had something else too. It had consequence. The news reached Camilla in the way most difficult news reaches powerful people, not through a formal announcement, but through the careful observations of someone close to her who had pieced together what was happening before it was made explicit. The details arrived in fragments. Anne's name was mentioned in the context of financial oversight. Then the word oversight was given a more specific definition. Then the picture came into focus all at once, and what the picture showed was unmistakable. Her husband, the King of England, had looked at the arrangements surrounding her household and had decided that they required a different hand. Not his own hand. His sister's hand. The choice of Anne in particular was not accidental, and Camilla knew it. Of all the people Charles could have brought in to examine or oversee the financial workings of her affairs, Anne was the one choice that carried both institutional weight and personal meaning. Anne was not an administrator appointed by a committee. Anne was family. Anne was the person whose opinion Charles trusted above almost anyone else's when it came to matters of conduct and responsibility. Within the institution, they had both served their entire lives. For a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding her public image, who had endured more scrutiny and more outright public contempt than almost anyone connected to the British crown in the modern era, and who had finally, at enormous personal cost, arrived at a position of genuine dignity and acceptance, the news carried a particular kind of sting. It was not simply about money. Money in the royal context was always also about something else, about power, about trust, about the question of who was seen as responsible and who was seen as needing to be managed. To have Anne placed in oversight of her financial affairs was to be positioned, however carefully, on the wrong side of that question. It was to be the person who needed managing rather than the person who managed. Inside the palace, where every gesture and every arrangement carried symbolic weight far beyond its practical meaning, that distinction was not a small one. Those who observed Camilla in the days immediately following her understanding of the decision described her as composed. She was always composed. It was one of the qualities that had served her most consistently across a very long time in public life. She did not perform distress, not publicly and rarely even privately with anyone outside her closest circle. She continued to attend her engagements. She smiled in exactly the right ways at exactly the right moments. She said what needed to be said and moved through her calendar with the practiced ease of someone who had learned, over many years, that the most useful thing a woman in her position could do when things were difficult was simply to keep going. But those who knew her well could see something underneath the composure that had not been there before, a carefulness, a watchfulness, a sense of someone who was calculating, not in a scheming way, but in the way that anyone calculates when they realize the ground beneath them has shifted, and they are not entirely sure yet where the solid ground is. Princess Anne, for her part, accepted the role with the same directness she brought to everything else in her life. She did not make speeches about it. She did not brief the press. She did not position herself publicly as someone who had been given a significant new responsibility, which she had. What she did was begin. Anne's approach to any task she took on had always been the same: understand the scope, understand the details, ask the right questions of the right people, and then proceed without sentiment. She had spent more than half a century operating this way. She had carried out official engagements in conditions that would have stopped most people half her age. She had represented the crown in parts of the world that rarely appeared on the royal family's usual itinerary. She was not interested in the theater of responsibility. She was interested in responsibility itself. What Anne found, when she began looking carefully at the financial arrangements she had been asked to oversee, was a picture more complicated than a simple tale of extravagance or impropriety would suggest. The reality, as it emerged through careful examination, was something more specific, and in some ways more troubling. It was not that Camilla was spending recklessly in ways that were obvious to anyone who looked. It was that the system surrounding her household had developed, gradually and without any single dramatic decision, a looseness that was inconsistent with the standards Charles had established and expected throughout the royal household. Categories had blurred. Authorizations had become informal in ways that created ambiguity. There were decisions that should have gone through a formal approval process that had instead been handled in ways that bypassed those channels, not necessarily with any intent to deceive, but in the casual manner of someone who had become accustomed to a certain level of personal discretion that the existing frameworks were not designed to permit. This distinction mattered enormously to Anne because it affected how the situation needed to be handled. If the problem was straightforward misconduct, the path forward would be straightforward as well. But if the problem was systems that had grown loose and undefined, then the solution required something more careful: the establishment of proper structures, clear lines of authorization, defined categories, and consistent reporting that could not be rerouted through informal channels. Anne understood bureaucratic structure the way she understood most things, practically without romance. She began building what needed to be built: new reporting lines, clearer documentation requirements, an approval process for categories of expenditure that had previously been handled on an ad hoc basis. These were not punitive measures. They were, in the language of institutional management, good governance. But within the specific context of the British royal family, where good governance could be and often was experienced as a very particular kind of correction, they were also something more. The atmosphere inside the palace during this period was, by all accounts from those who observed it closely, exceptionally tense. There was the tension between Camilla and Anne, which had previously expressed itself mostly in the cool formality of public appearances, where both women knew their roles and played them well. Now there was an additional layer: the knowledge that the formality between them was backed by something structural, something that gave Anne an authority over a portion of Camilla's affairs that had not previously existed. There was also the tension between those in the palace who were loyal to Camilla's household and those who understood their primary loyalty to be to the king. In any institution, a change in oversight creates factions. The palace was not different from other institutions in this respect, only more practiced at keeping those factions invisible to the outside world. What could not be kept fully invisible was the shift in atmosphere that several observers noticed at public events during this period. The garden party at Buckingham Palace that became a subject of particular comment drew attention, precisely because the tension between Anne and Camilla was, according to those present, visible in a way that such things at royal events almost never are. These were two women who had long ago learned to occupy the same spaces with perfect correctness. The fact that the perfect correctness had developed, according to those who were there, a noticeable edge, was significant in the way that small cracks in a well-maintained surface are always significant. They do not mean the structure is failing, but they mean the pressure inside it is real. Charles watched all of this with the particular kind of attention he had developed over a lifetime of navigating complicated family dynamics within an institution that ran on the management of appearances. He had grown up watching his parents maintain a marriage that served the crown and served the nation while operating, in its personal dimensions, at a temperature that was rarely warm. He had lived through the most public marital collapse in modern royal history. He had watched his sons navigate their own very different struggles with the demands of royal life and the pressures of their personal lives intersecting in ways that played out on front pages around the world. He was not innocent of what he had done when he put Anne in charge. He had made a choice that would create friction. He had made it anyway because he believed it was correct. But belief in correctness did not mean he was unaffected by what the choice was producing. There were evenings, those closest to him would later reflect, when the king seemed quieter than usual, more inward, sitting with a kind of stillness that was different from the composed thoughtfulness he normally projected. He was a man who had asked his sister to watch over his wife's finances. In the abstract, in the language of institutional governance, this was simply a sensible decision made by a responsible monarch. In the concrete, in the reality of two people who shared a home and a life and a history that stretched back decades, it was something considerably more painful than that. Charles had never expected being king to be easy. What he perhaps had not fully anticipated was how specifically and personally difficult some of its hardest moments would feel. The thing about decisions made inside royal families is that they rarely stay contained to the people they were made about. They travel. They acquire meaning as they move from one person to the next, each retelling adding a layer of interpretation, each layer of interpretation changing the weight of the thing slightly, until by the time a decision has traveled its full circuit through a household as large and as complex as the British royal family, it has become something larger than the original intention ever anticipated. What Charles had intended as a private measure of institutional correction had, by the time several months had passed, become something that the palace's most experienced observers were watching very carefully indeed. A realignment of trust, a redistribution of quiet power, and a signal about the future of the monarchy that those who understood how the institution actually worked found deeply significant. Princess Anne had, by this point, fully settled into the role she had been asked to assume. This was characteristic of her. She did not warm up to things gradually or ease into responsibilities over time. When Anne took something on, she took it on completely. The financial oversight framework she had established was functioning. The reporting lines were clearer. The ambiguities that had existed in the previous arrangements had been replaced by defined procedures. From a purely administrative standpoint, the job was being done well, which surprised no one who knew Anne's reputation for precision and insistence on getting things right. What was more complicated, and what those inside the palace corridors were watching with the closest attention, was what the doing of the job was doing to everything else. Camilla had, in the months since the arrangement was put in place, continued to conduct herself with the discipline that had become the defining quality of her public life. She showed up. She spoke well. She represented the crown at events large and small with the same relaxed professionalism that had earned her genuine credit from observers who had expected her never to succeed in the role. None of that had changed. What had changed was something harder to photograph and harder to describe, but unmistakable to anyone who spent time in the rooms where it was present: the quality of the relationship between Camilla and the people immediately around her. There was a guardedness that had not previously been there, a careful management of what was said in which company. The easy confidence that had characterized her earlier years in the role had acquired, without entirely disappearing, a more deliberate quality. She was still confident, but now the confidence was doing more visible work. It was being maintained, rather than simply expressed. The relationship between Charles and Camilla remained, in its outward dimensions, what it had always been: the relationship of two people who had chosen each other against enormous odds, and sustained that choice through circumstances that would have defeated most partnerships. They appeared together at official events in the way they always had. They traveled together. They occupied the same household. But those who observed them with the attention that palace life and royal journalism require noted that something in the texture of those appearances had shifted. There was a correctness to it now that had not previously been necessary. It was not coldness. It was not the performance of a failed marriage for public consumption. What it was, more precisely, was two people being very careful with each other, with the space between them, with the fact that something difficult had been done and neither of them had fully absorbed its consequences yet. Anne, meanwhile, had become what she had perhaps always been quietly becoming in the years since Charles's coronation, the person around whom the king's most practical and institutional confidence gathered. This was not a formal title. Anne had no interest in formal titles beyond the ones she had carried her whole life. What it was instead was a kind of gravitational reality. When Charles needed something done with precision and without drama, without the complicated politics of palace loyalty or the risk of someone using their proximity to him for purposes other than the task at hand, Anne was the person he returned to. She had earned this. She had earned it through 50 years of showing up when it was inconvenient, doing the work when no one was watching, and maintaining standards that were not subject to renegotiation because circumstances had changed or because someone important was made uncomfortable by them. The wider royal family observed all of this from their various positions, with the mixture of fascination and caution that major palace developments always produce. William and Catherine, who were navigating their own considerations about the future of the institution and their place in it, understood the significance of what was happening in their particular way, not as a family drama only, but as a demonstration of where authority within the crown was consolidating, and why. William had his own complicated relationship with Camilla, shaped by the particular grief of a son who had loved his mother and watched his father's marriage to someone else, a grief that had never been entirely resolved no matter how many years had passed or how much public acceptance Camilla had eventually achieved. The new arrangement did not simplify that complexity for William, but it perhaps clarified some things. His father, the king, was demonstrating that institutional accountability mattered more to him than personal comfort. That was something William recognized. It was something he had grown up watching the crown demand of everyone who served it, including himself. For the public, the story existed in fragments and rumors, and the occasional more pointed reporting from outlets that specialized in the internal dynamics of the royal family. There was no formal announcement. There would never be a formal announcement of something like this, because the British royal family does not formally announce the quiet decisions that reshape its internal architecture. What the public could observe were the effects, the changed atmospheres at photographed events, the shifting positions of figures in royal photographs, the subtle and always deniable signals that royal watchers had spent decades learning to read. Some of those signals, for those who knew what they were looking at, were speaking very clearly about something having changed in the palace that could not be changed back. The question that the people watching most closely found themselves returning to, as the months passed and the new arrangements settled into the routines of royal life, was not whether Charles had made the right decision. Reasonable people could disagree about that, and many of them did. The question that was harder to dismiss was what this decision said about the longer arc of things. Charles had always been a king with a very particular vision of what the monarchy should be: leaner, more transparent, more genuinely accountable to the nation it served, stripped of the excesses and the secrecies that had made it vulnerable to criticism, and occasionally to genuine public contempt. He had come to the throne with this vision intact, strengthened rather than diminished by the long years he had spent waiting to implement it. And now, in one of the most personal decisions of his reign, he had demonstrated that he was willing to apply the standards he preached even when applying them hurt him personally, even when applying them meant inviting complexity into his own home. That, in the end, was what made the decision genuinely significant, not the particular financial arrangements it addressed, not the specific dynamics it altered within the household at Clarence House, but the principle it demonstrated. Charles had put Anne in charge not because he was trying to punish Camilla, not because the situation had reached any kind of dramatic point of crisis, but because the standards he believed in demanded it, and he was not willing to make an exception for his own wife, simply because making the exception would have been more comfortable. This was the Charles that the people who knew him best had always argued existed beneath the formal surface, a man with a genuine and inflexible core of principle, capable of difficult decisions, even when the cost of those decisions was paid in the currency of his own domestic peace. Anne understood what she had been given and what she had been asked to do. She carried out the responsibility the way she carried out every responsibility that had ever been asked of her, completely, precisely, without self-promotion and without apology. She had, in her public comment about Camilla during the coronation documentary, praised her sister-in-law for understanding her role and for doing it well. Those words were spoken in a particular moment, and they reflected something true about that moment. But the situation inside the palace had evolved, as situations inside any living institution always do, and what was true in one moment was not necessarily the full truth of the next. Anne had adapted to what the new moment required, because adapting to what a moment requires without losing the essential character of who you are was perhaps the most fundamental skill anyone who served the crown for any length of time was eventually required to develop. Camilla remained queen. She would remain queen. The arrangement that had been put in place around her financial affairs was a correction of a particular kind of system failure, not a statement about her fitness for the role she occupied or the legitimacy of the position she had reached. She had worked too long and paid too great a personal price for that position to be taken from her by any arrangement of oversight or accountability. And Charles, whatever the complications and whatever the painful quiet that had settled between them in the months since the decision, was still the man who had loved her when loving her was the most costly personal choice he could make. That did not change. What changed was the understanding they now both lived with, that inside the institution they served, the institution would always, in the end, ask more than either of them had expected. It would ask for the things that were hardest to give. It had asked before. It was asking again now, and they were, each in their own way, trying to answer. The palace, ancient and adjusting, moved forward in the way it always had, with ceremony on the outside, with consequence on the inside, and with the knowledge carried by every person who served within it long enough to see clearly that the distance between those two things was where the real history was always being made.